Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar from the CIPR Health Group. This webinar is Countering Thrilling Falsehoods with Alex Aitken and Stefan Rollnick, and I'll introduce Alex and Stefan in a second, but first to introduce myself. My name is Sam Wallace. I'm one of the co-chairs at CIPR's Health Group. I'm just going to be doing a bit of an introduction today before handing over to the actual stars of the event. But just some quick housekeeping before we get started, so people are aware. Today's session is going to be recorded. This is so we can share it with more people after the event, and people can watch back who weren't able to make it today. The bulk of the session is going to be a conversation between Stefan and Alex around disinformation and misinformation, but there is going to be time for yourselves to ask questions at the end. So as we go through, if there's anything you want to follow up on, any interesting questions you think of, please do use the Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your screen to drop those questions in. We'll be keeping an eye on those as we go through the session and pulling out as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. I'm sure a lot of people on the call are already CIPR members, but just to give a bit of background to those of you who aren't, the CIPR is the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, and they're a well-chartered professional body for public relations practitioners, whose members are working PR professionals in the UK, but also around the world. Within the CIPR, there's a large number of groups who organise activity for sectors of professionals or groups of professionals who work in particular parts of the country. And we're the health group who organise events for people who work within health, PR and communications. And we put on events like this that hopefully bring interesting topics to our members, but also non-members who are interested in our work. So I'm just going to quickly say a bit about our two guests today. So Stefan Rollnick is a graduate of Aspen UK's Rising Young Leaders Fellowship, and currently a misinformation strategist and head of the misinformation cell at global communications agency LIN, responsible for providing strategic consultancy to clients on how to address mis and disinformation. Stefan has advised the WEF, WHO, UK and Welsh Government departments, UK-based health agencies and much more. Stefan developed a passion for fighting mis and disinformation after spending time at Chatham House and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, before moving on to a position as misinformation analyst in the Office of the First Minister of Wales, where he supported government communications teams in their fight against mis and disinformation. And Alex Aitken is currently Executive Director of the Government Communications Service, which he created and developed from 2012, responsible for security, international and cabinet office communication. He served as Head of Profession over 2013 to 2021 and was a former Director of Communications and Strategy for Westminster City Council. In his spare time, he's Chairman of Westminster Wanderers Football Club, member of Surrey County Cricket Club and an Arsenal fan. So welcome both Stefan and Rollnick. So I'm going to hand over to Stefan now. And Stefan, I wonder if you can just start off today's session by giving us a bit of definition of what we mean by misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Sam. I was tempted to start us off on a question about Arsenal there as a fellow Arsenal fan, but I think given Sunday's result, we'll maybe move on from that pretty quickly. So definitions is the first place we often start at with these conversations, and you'll notice that people use misinformation and disinformation often interchangeably. They'll describe it as disinformation, and I'd like to caveat the definitions here, and Alex may disagree with me here, but I think often we get too wrapped up in definitions, and definitions are helpful because they tell us something about intent. So misinformation, broadly speaking, is misleading or false information spread without the intent to mislead and cause harm, where disinformation is done deliberately. D for disinformation was how I first remembered it. And it's useful in a number of ways. It's useful if it is of strategic importance for us to know who is behind the spreading of the mis and disinformation, and there's a security element to it there. Often what we find is disinformation tends to be the more politically divisive and corrosive narratives and conspiracy theories we see as well, whereas misinformation often can be much less politically polarized and politically charged. But that's up for debate, and I think the more people you speak to in this field, the more perspectives you'll hear on that. But at Lynn, we try to focus on information that can cause harm, and I think in a bit we're going to get onto the Wall of Beliefs toolkit, which Alex's government communication service developed, and we're now using at Lynn. And one of the things that we really like about that toolkit is its focus on the fact that information can cause harm, and focusing on that specifically. But Alex, before we move on, how did I do there? Mark my homework. Was that a broadly accurate summary of the picture?
Well, look, I think that's pretty good, Stefan. And I would highlight both the Resist Toolkit and the Wall of Beliefs, which are available on the GCS website. If you Google GCS, you'll get the Glasgow Coma Scale, and under that, you'll get the Government Communications Service. And I would encourage all the participants who've done us the honour of coming to this event today to scroll through that. So I'm going to refer to page 8 of the Resist Toolkit, where we do offer some definitions. And I agree with what you said, Stefan. I just want, for the purpose of this seminar, to reinforce that. Misinformation, verifiably false information that is shared without intent to mislead. So my daughter believed when she was that age that Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, was a champion skateboarder because she'd seen it on Instagram. It is misinformation. It is not true, but no one's attempting to mislead. Disinformation, as you said, verifiably false information that's shared with intent to deceive and mislead, usually from hostile states. So a dramatic example of that is the timely Russian threats to nuke us. It is demonstrably false. They are not going to do that, but they think it is a way of dividing British society. And Resist has a third definition, which is sort of helpful, but really is a derivation of disinformation. We talk about malinformation, which is deliberately misleads by twisting the meaning of truthful information. And that is when people seek to take something. For instance, we are currently running a campaign on emergency alerts. We'll test the national system of emergency alerts on Sunday at 3 o'clock. And there are various people. There was a consumer expert who said this will stop you making transactions on Amazon and elsewhere at 3 o'clock on Sunday. No, it won't. You have twisted truthful information to try and mislead. So miss, dis, and mal. But again, I would agree. I'll give you an A for your homework, Stefan.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think that's a really useful place to start us, because it gives us the broader picture of mis and disinformation. But I wanted to narrow us down to health mis and disinformation to move this on. And obviously you had a front row seat during the COVID-19 pandemic to, I suppose, what it means to be a communicator at its most kind of highest stakes environment, where communicating the right message was saving lives in the most obvious sense. And I'm just wondering, not just on an intellectual and strategic level, but also on a human level, as a human being who was in that environment, what you learned about health misinformation, health disinformation from that experience that you didn't know before.
Yeah, look, you're always aware when you're privileged to hold the roles that I've held, that you stand on the shoulders of giants. And when government communications was established as a formal part of government, as the Department for Education for Information in 1917, it had a remit. John Buchan was the first director, the famous novelist, to deliver the government story during the first great European war of that century, and to counter disinformation. And it's built up from there. And we can talk about experience of Churchill, who said that truth was so important, sometimes it had to be guarded by a bodyguard of lies. But nevertheless, I make those points because I was looking and preparing for this seminar. there is, again, on the GCS website, you'll find the COVID Advisory Board report, which was a piece of work we did with the CIPR and with other organisations. But Alice McCaffrey, Mandy Pierce, who was president during that period, helped us greatly with that. And there are some of the answers in that, and also in passing, referred to my friend and a former leader of the CIPR, the late Francis Higham, who was also part of the team that did that report, as Francis did so much good for the public relations profession. But on a human level, there's one really important point: the power of health professionals, the power of the NHS brand, the power of truth well told. The reason we did the press conferences was because we wanted to go direct, routinely 5 million people, up to 30 million of us, of Brits, to explain what the government was trying to achieve. And in terms of countering disinformation, then if you tell your story in a compelling way, and we talk in the Resist Toolkit about the prove doctrine, which I will come back to, but the sort of scientific approach to communications. But at a human level, every morning, I sat down with the expert team. We had a brigadier from the British Army, 77 Brigade's Counter Disinformation Unit, who were looking at state-based threats, public health experts. We had our marketing company, our retained agency, other civil servants. And we were looking for disinformation, but we were looking for disinformation that had the ability to take on a life of its own. Some things, as I think I'll say more than once during this seminar, are best left alone because they won't actually gain the traction that then misleads and divides people and communities. But that daily assessment of what might damage us, the 5G conspiracy was an example where people trying to set fire to pylons, which clearly we had to intervene. But there was some mad stuff that actually wasn't going to get much traction amongst those groups of people who are always going to believe in conspiracies. So
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because, Alex, you said something there which I think is worth picking out and framing framing, straight up framing, put it on the wall, but worth framing the discussion as well, which is some things are best left alone. And I think, speaking to that human level, that's one of the hardest things to do as a communicator, to know when it's best to leave something alone, to watch and to wait, to do nothing.
Yeah.
Just wondering in a bigger picture sense, and the Resist Toolkit does flesh this out in more details, but what kind of questions should communicators have in the back of their minds? And you've touched on at least one of them already. What kind of questions should communicators have in the back of their minds when they're approaching this broader question of when is something best left alone?
Yeah. I'm going to refer to page 18 of the toolkit, but a lighter aside would be when a player comes on for the opposition team at the Arsenal who is not well known, the crowd will chant, "Who are you?" And that is relevant because, as public relations professionals, it's like, who are we? What is the reputation we're trying to protect? And there are organisations on this call who want to protect their medical reputation for integrity, but they don't aspire to be AI wizards or defence specialists. They absolutely understand the reputation they're trying to protect, which is why on page 18 of the toolkit, we set out, look, your corporate objectives, the information you need to protect, the brand attributes, and the audiences you need to reassure, you need to define those. For instance, on the audiences, they will typically be more vulnerable audiences who are more susceptible to propaganda, be it young people, 18 to 24s, and we've done some work with Lad Bible on this recently in terms of state-led disinformation, or more people who are vulnerable to illness. The objectives, is the disinformation challenging your corporate objectives? If not, then perhaps leave it alone because it's not going to get much traction. So objectives, information to protect, brands to protect, and audiences to protect are the formal way we go around assessing when you intervene.
Fantastic. And I think we've mentioned the toolkit a few times now. So I think what I'll do is I'll just give us a quick overview of some of the different pillars that are found in the toolkit. And then maybe we can get into some of the details of that and explore some of the broader questions around those pillars. So the toolkit is split up into these pillars, broadly speaking, and it breaks down as the following. So the importance of recognizing, this is about understanding precisely what it is we're concerned about, this question we've just addressed there of harm. The next one is, early warning. What are the early signs of an emerging issue? And also knowing your vulnerabilities as an organization, as a brand or a campaign. This question of situational insight, so making intelligence as actionable and consequential as possible. Impact analysis, which I know runs through all of GCS's work around techniques of making an assessment on, the impact, in this case, of whether a piece of information is going to result in harm, but also on the flip side, tracking the effectiveness of our approach as well. And in between those two things, the information causing harm and our approach is strategic communication, so developing this effective strategy for mitigating harm. But I want to pick up on something we were talking about earlier, actually, before the webinar started, where we're trying to identify exactly when it was the first Resist toolkit was created, because this is obviously Resist 2.0, but still with that same mission of supporting communicators in their fight against misinformation. Alex, could you run us through kind of some of the big things that have changed and why they've changed?
Yeah, I will say, before I do that, just to build on what you said about Resist, I mean, the recognize, the R of Resist is very much, there is billions of stuff out there. We say in the paper, and I assume it's still true, that 500 hours of content are uploaded to YouTube. So recognizing the bit of the information environment that you can influence is crucial. Otherwise, in that horrible management phrase, you'll be trying to boil the ocean. You explain the E and the S. The impact analysis is really important to understand. There is no point in walking into boardroom with acres of data. You need the data that can be used. So I'll give you a practical example. During the royal funeral, we tracked misinformation, disinformation, and it was interesting that the Russian and Chinese states started off by saying, we're very sorry to hear of the death of Queen Elizabeth, and then they quickly reverted to, but the UK is struggling, how will it survive in the post-Elizabethan era, is the new king up to it? It was interesting that they dropped those narratives quite quickly. And my hypothesis is because even amongst their own people, they didn't really track. So we could have gone back on the Russian and Chinese state stuff, but it didn't feel like it was necessary, given their own people presumably were not buying this stuff, so it was left alone. We had a ministerial meeting each day during the royal funeral, and I did the communications report, and I remember being asked about halfway through, look, there's this article in the Daily Telegraph that says that the funeral organisation is chaotic and it's not going to work and it's all going to be problematic. And they all turn to me and go, what are you going to do about it? And the way I answered is to say, look, you can see the data reports that we bring in to the daily meetings. They look like this from our media monitoring teams. The Daily Telegraph article would have probably got about 250,000 readers, roughly. I said, look, the biggest piece of content we've tracked today, which is more representative of tone and sentiment and volume of coverage, is David Beckham's story of being in the queue for 24 hours, where he praises the organisation, the government effort, the head of state, as was Prince Charles or the new king, and so on. And that's got 13.5 million views. 13.5 million plays 250,000. Which side do you want to be on? At that point, ministers go, okay, we get it, stick to the story. So the strategic communications part of Resist, the story you tell, is so important. And then the tracking effectiveness, the final bit, allows you to create a library. So you can look back and say, is this the sort of thing that's going to gain traction? If it's about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it might do. If it's about worthy policy or even disinformation about policy, less so. So I hope that's helpful.
No, that's incredibly helpful. And actually, I want to, because I can see the time ticking on, and actually, I really want to jump into something specific here around this what you just outlined there of having, serious stakeholders coming to you and saying, what are we going to do about this? And I think for many communicators, that's becoming a more familiar feeling with most of our clients that we work with. We're not just working with the client to support their work, we're working with the client to often reassure people internally who are seeing the, for example, in your example, the lines around, will Britain be able to cope? But there's countless other examples of these red herrings or these early warning signs that aren't, quite requiring a robust response yet, but are still triggering huge amounts of anxiety in a specific organization. And one of the things that's been really helpful for us as practitioners is the Wall of Beliefs framework. And I know we're signposting people to the Wall of Beliefs framework, but for me, the thing that's so exciting about the Wall of Beliefs framework is it connects the academic, the behavioral understanding of mis and disinformation with the real world life of the practitioner. And Alex, I wonder if you could just talk us through a kind of basic overview of how the Wall of Beliefs toolkit helps strategic communicators make smart decisions about what to respond to and perhaps what not to respond to.
Certainly. So I will never support any other football team than Arsenal. That's part of my core belief system because I grew up with them. I'm from North London, my friends and took me from an early age. And that is something I'm never going to vote Manchester United. Come election time, I may well vote Liberal Democrat or Labour or Conservative. My views are malleable on that sense. So it is a system, the Wall of Beliefs is a system that seeks to say, look at people's understanding of the world and how it is formed and think carefully about whether the belief that they hold can be moved or whether it's so central to their being that it's unlikely to be moved. And we offer 4 strategies for moving people's understanding their behaviour. And again, the thing is on the GCS website. Where beliefs are not likely to cause harmful behaviour, where they are just views that people hold, they're guided by astrology, they believe in the stars rather than science. We'd advocate watch and wait. That's not something that's likely to affect, as we talked earlier, about your core organisational objectives, your audiences, your information. Where people say black is white, for argument's sake, pick a company, AstraZeneca are evil, then that probably, if you're working for AstraZeneca, or actually if you're working for the British government, you would, rather than watch and wait, the reactive response to rebut and challenge directly, just because it's an immediate challenge to your core reputation and you have to deal with it. The third strategy is to manage behaviours, and this is where, if you're dealing with some deeply held behaviours, then you have to focus on the behaviours first and the beliefs later. A simple example of this would be smoking. People like my father, who smoked from 14 years old, very difficult to shift, but you have to challenge it because it would help him live a longer life and so on. So the behaviours point there is to nudge, sometimes shove, occasionally smack the behaviours by changing the way that cigarettes are perceived, by stopping the way that they are, as the successive governments have done, the way they are shown and stored in shops. And the final bit, watch and wait, reactive response, manage behaviours, on page 11 of the Wall of Beliefs toolkit, proactive promotion, which is where, what I would say, is where you take a counter-brand approach. And the simplest way of explaining this is where we are not going to seek to, we respect the Russian people and Russia's history, but we are never going to try and mitigate or explain away President Putin's actions. We have a counter-brand strategy, proactive promotion of our ideals as a democratic state, which is tolerant, which is open, and is free, and guided by law. And they do things entirely differently, and we believe that is wrong. So that's the sort of punchy end of things, even accepting that many Russians will have faith in President Putin for their own reasons, not least the dominance of state television. So I hope that whistle-stop tour is helpful, Stefan.
Yeah, no, it is, and I can only strongly recommend that members on this call go and take a look at that toolkit, we find huge amounts of use and value in it, particularly in trying to, we're working on at the moment, trying to integrate quantitative insights as well into this idea of core beliefs and likelihood to cause harm, which is, I can say, has revolutionized the way that we work. And so you're looking at a true believer here, everyone on the call. The Wall of Beliefs toolkit really is helpful. But Alex, before we're gonna move on to questions from attendees now. There's a couple of things I just wanted to kind of land us on to finish off. The first was earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned 1917, the department, was it for information? And I'm wondering, for communicators on this call for whom the pace of change in the information environment is so rapid that this challenge feels overwhelming, of addressing health misinformation, health disinformation, or protecting their work and their organization. I'm wondering, counterintuitively, what hasn't changed since 1917? What remains the same in your eyes from when this was first set up in government? What rules for communicators are the same now as they were then? What things can we hold on to as our kind of guiding forces, these truisms that are always going to be important in fighting health mis and disinformation?
Number one, truth well told. We all know in a crisis, it's not the crisis that kills the organisational reputation, it's the mishandling of the phases of the crisis that kills the organisation and endangers the job of the minister or the chief executive or whoever it is. I mean, certainly, it's a sad duty of any government communicator at any time to deal with a number of crises, understanding the whole picture and being quite tough and unrelenting in what is the worst that can happen. 1917, there are familiarities with 2023. Wallace crops up in both the original 1917 memo from John Buchan to David Lloyd George, then Prime Minister. Different type of Wallace in 1917, still there. And actually the structure of the communication team that can be seen on the memo, which we have published somewhere, is remarkably familiar. There are sort of a campaign section, there's domestic, there's foreign, there's there's a wireless team, and there's a press team. So all these things are part of our doctrine. Certainly, when I worked for John Major when he was Prime Minister during the 1990s, and now, what has changed absolutely is the speed of the news cycle. We calculate the news cycle is 3 times as fast in the UK as it is in Germany, for example, and therefore responding to that. There is therefore part of the point of resist, Stefan, is to say, don't try and respond to everything. Be clear about what you stand for, be clear about the important areas, and respond when you need to challenge something that's integral to your reputation. But let the flow of Twitter go on because it will do naturally. Back to you.
No, absolutely. And I think I've done a poor job here of checking the question and answer section, but it looks like we do have some questions in here. And I'm wondering, just over to CIPR colleagues, whether you want myself to put these to Alex or you want to jump in. Apologies, we did discuss this before, but...
No problem, Stefan. I don't mind jumping in with the questions to save you having to multitask.
Thanks for bailing me out, Sam.
No problem at all. And thanks to those who've sent their questions in already. Do keep dropping them in the Q&A. The first one we have a question about what are the biggest skills we need to develop within communications to rise to the challenge of disinformation. Alex, I don't know if you'd like to take that first, because I know GCS do a lot of good work around kind of competencies and career development, and might want to touch on some of that here as well.
Yeah, I'd offer, I've thought about this, Sam, I'll offer 5 V's. Visual, video, voices, volume, and values. And to briefly explain those, some of the saddest things I've ever had to do is talk to people as career chats who say, I just want to be a press officer. It's like, I'm sorry, that's pretty career limiting. I need people who can do visual, video communications, who can take great photographs, who can do videos. Easy to say, less to do routinely well, but those are the core skills of the current and future communicator. Voices. front page of the Daily Mail today, emergency alerts, it's all problematic. I need voices as a government communicator, voices from the blue light services, voices as diverse as people who run park run to your baby club, who will properly, as this is a public information campaign, it's not partly political, say actually these emergency alerts, these are happening, this is why they're happening, we get it, it's the sound that can save your life. So third parties. Volume. I genuinely believe that we live in a world, and we absolutely found this with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. At the start of the conflict, we were delivering 10 communication interventions every day. Just before this meeting, I was talking to my colleague who is chairing the weekly briefing we do, background briefing with Defence Intelligence. We do a separate briefing with former senior security officials, back to voices, which is our way of delivering volume. And I'd say to people in the corporate world who are sort of scared of communicating, I'm not sure unless you communicate now, you can build the goodwill when the crisis comes to meet that crisis. So volume is important. And finally, values. We're lucky in the civil service and the government comms service, we have very strong values which are practical and used, not theoretical and left on the shelf. And with any organisation, it goes back to knowing who you stand for. Unless you can communicate through your work those values, not whitewash, not greenwash, but actually values you live, then I don't think you will have the skills to succeed.
Great, thank you, Alex. And I guess Stefan, on that question, this is your day job. I mean, what do you think the most valuable skills you've developed are to enable you to do this job well?
Well, the first thing to say is I've still got a lot of room for improvement and development. So I don't claim to be a black belt in this information, but I think it's funny. Some of the most damaging and corrosive effects of mis and disinformation I have found is not the information impact necessarily, but the very real human impact it has on communicators. It creates paralysis. It's this almost small c conservative force, not in the political sense, but in that it creates paralysis. It creates doubt in the minds of communicators, and it distracts us from our messaging, and it drains our energy. And when speaking with clients, one of the first things I always say is, the worst thing you can do right now is stop telling your story. That's the worst thing. So if there's step one, and that's advice that we give for free, and they can then disregard us after that if they want. But that's the one thing we try to come away from all those conversations, is people retaining that sense of confidence. And that's really hard because, Sam, we're speaking to communicators, for example, in local authorities around the country who are trying to communicate really important changes to things like traffic flow in order to clear up air pollution and to hit our climate targets. But communicators are doing this while they've got the depths of Twitter screaming into their ears 24/7, and it becomes really hard to know when to listen to the noise and how to interpret the noise, and quite frankly when to shut out the noise and to see beyond it. And I think that's something that's often gets lost in the emotional weight of the challenge of mis and disinformation. And so I think for me, in terms of skills or attributes, I think resilience is a massive piece for communicators, particularly as the culture wars on social media ramp up.
Thank you, Stefan. So we've also had a couple of questions that are quite health focused that I might try and bring together here. So I think there's a recognition that often health issues in the health sector can be quite complex and can be quite specialist. And as communicators, we need to try and simplify those and be quite punchy. But there's a kind of a balance there to do that, but also not create more confusion or make things not as clear as they can that might aid disinformation. So how we might kind of tackle that. And I think a specific example is around the current workforce challenges within the health sector, and how we might go about tackling some of the misinformation around that particular challenge. I don't know, Alex or Stefan, which one of you would like to pick that up first?
I will kick off. I mean, number one, I would say, use the toolkit to work through how far that is integral to your core values and how far it's undermining and what volume it is. Clearly, health service workforce volume discussions are high volume and are integral. And going back to the point about the wall of beliefs, that is probably one of those areas where the beliefs, we know from the ballots on pay, the beliefs are movable. So that's more of a case for a reactive response, the rebuttal approach, than it is for a more sophisticated, longer-term campaign, given that it is in the moment. But using the toolkit to do the analysis and having the volume and understanding the messages. I'm looking at page 30 and 31 of the toolkit, where we give some examples of the assessment reports, situational awareness in part of resist, and looking at it in black and white and discussing with colleagues how much of an issue, how far does it attack our core values, what is the volume, how could we respond, I think would be the way I would answer a good and tough question.
I think the only thing I would add to that, on building on the wall of beliefs toolkit, is how important it is, and we often go back and forth with clients on this, how important it is to understand in your context, what is your definition of harm, real world harm? How is information likely to harm your organization? Because there's no good sending us out there to kind of stop people saying things that aren't true on the internet. It's an impossible task. But if we can really zero in on, I think that speaks to what Alex was saying around what are your core organizational values or vulnerabilities on the flip side that you are most focused on. When you start diving into that, and often down to the granularities of specific behaviors as well, when you can understand where real world harm is, we can work back from that to understand what information or misinformation is more likely or less likely to bring about real world harm. But I think just briefly on the point of simplification versus complexity, I mean, it's a spectrum, of course, and it's a tension. It's probably a healthy tension that exists in a lot of communications. I would say one of the things I've learned from ongoing client projects we've got at the moment is simplification is great, but be very wary of information vacuums. Information vacuums can potentially be our biggest vulnerability, where we have anxious audiences who may project their kind of worst fears onto them. So that's a healthy tension without a clear answer, but it's definitely a good question.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. And we've also had a great question looking at the challenges and opportunities presented by new AI tools in the future. So just really wondering what the impact of tools such as ChatGPT will be on managing disinformation in the future. Alex, shall I come to you first on that one?
Yeah. So this was an issue we're discussing today. I mean, the frightening thing is it will be a lot more difficult in the future because of the developing sophistication and the misuse of these tools. I draw your attention to articles in the FT last Wednesday where the test for AI is can you make a stir fry with concrete? And the FT reported that the Chinese tools that have been rushed out to compete with ChatGPT say you can make a stir fry with concrete, whereas ChatGPT says no, you can't, because concrete's like not edible. So 1-0 to Microsoft. But the Chinese state quickly stepped in and said that if their state companies, Alibaba, are going to produce these things, they must conform with socialist values and must not undermine the state. I think that defeats the point of AI. But nevertheless, it is a development we are watching, and I think the initial step is to master the use of them. I use it and used it in various speeches. They're a good guide, but they're sometimes wrong. They can come up with utterly mad suggestions, but they can provide a degree of inspiration. So they add to the stuff that's already out there, from Wikipedia to BBC, and we need to continue to monitor it.
Yeah, I can't claim to be an expert. I'm very much learning and self-educating. In terms of personal use, I have it's my girlfriend's birthday later this week, and I have solicited ChatGPT's help in writing funny limericks, so I can say it's helpful specifically in that sense. I think in terms of potential and dangers, I think Alex's point on China there touched on the important thing, which is these technologies don't exist in a moral vacuum, and that very much determines the opportunities and the dangers. And in my previous experience around looking at big tech regulation, social media, mis and disinformation, I think one of the things that we learned there is often we think we're dealing with an informational challenge in its entirety, but we realize that informational challenge is part of a broader ecosystem. We have challenges of, regulation and profit motive and all these rest of these things, which aren't morally necessarily black and white, but are complex issues which do determine it. So I think the potentials and dangers question, we shouldn't just look at that through a kind of how scary is the technology lens. It's kind of what society is this technology being birthed into, and how is that going to shape how it's going to get used as well.
I think that's really helpful. And I think that the next question kind of builds on that, on some of that international dimension you've both talked about there. And I think it might be interesting to hear about any work GCS might be doing with partner agencies in other countries to look at kind of misinformation, disinformation that exists on a global scale, and what opportunities you think there might be to learn from what other countries are doing in this space as well. Alex, I don't know, is there anything you could say on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm proud of from our work during the pandemic, and the credit accrues to colleagues rather than myself, but the work we did with the WHO on pre-bunking and the Go Viral game designed to inoculate people. And there are all sorts of ways that are now being developed to inoculate people, to make them aware of what misinformation looks like. We've currently got a partnership with Lad Bible, where Lad Bible have written a story about the Loch Ness Monster has been seen by a couple eating their fish and chips. And the story goes on and says, look, this is disinformation, and this is why you need to be aware. With the WHO, the idea of inoculation by using the Go Viral game to show people how things happen. The Economist from the 8th of April, NATO, the European Commission, the Global Engagement Centre, Harmony Square, the Canadian government. You can download Lizards and Lies, a board game, which I have done, which is really good. So the gamification, inspired by the WHO, to pre-bunk, to make people aware of disinformation, is an integral and additional part of this work.
And Stefan, I don't know if in this space where Lynn, whether you look to kind of what's happening on a kind of wider context to inform your practice.
Yeah, I mean, we can't avoid it. I think often I think this is the part of the toolkit around tracking effectiveness in a broader sense. We have to be mindful of the political context and a lot of the countries we're working in and the clients we're working for, and how much of that is beyond our control. When you're working on mis and disinformation, you have several major democracies who are kind of rapidly and concerningly polarizing and calcifying that polarization. It affects your ability to move the needle, and it's that truism from American politics, which I can never remember exactly who it was who said this, but the winners always seem smarter than they are, and the losers always seem stupider than they are. And I think being mindful of that, especially as we work in international contexts where these are big global forces being driven by technology and inequality and global competition between different nation states, it's hard, and we should acknowledge that and give ourselves some room to find that difficult.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time, and we're closely coming to the end of today's session. Stefan, I know you've got I don't know if you want to close us off with your great post-it note example of a key takeaway and use that to
Sure. I mean, I was tempted to end us on whether Alex thinks Arsenal are going to win the league this season, but I'll spare the rest of the attendees from that. Maybe we'll have that discussion offline, Alex. But so I'm obviously a misinformation strategist, and I will often keep post-it notes on my desk of things that I need to remember. It might be work related, it might be remember to drink more water, call your mum, but often it's something about a client. It's something specific I need to remember with a client, or it's a broader thing that I'm trying to remember or trying to be more mindful of. But if I was to put a post-it note right here on the corner of my laptop to remind me of something about how to fight misinformation in a way that's smart and strategic, so that before I make these decisions, I take a breath and consider it. What am I putting on that post-it note? Oh, sorry, Alex. What? Oh, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So the question being, What's this reminder? What's this one thing I need to remember in how to fight mis and disinformation that I'm sticking with?
I'm going to pick up on James's question, and thank you, James, for posing the question in the chat. The first thing I say is that, you know, my answer is basically, look, we wrote the Resist Toolkit with chapters where you can work through and build the dashboards that we recommend and write down your own values, the things that are important to you, and then assess what is going on. So I hope that helps. But use the toolkit chapter by chapter. The British government first issued a warning against disinformation in 1688. So I don't think the pandemic has changed the nature of it. It's always been thus. It's the volume that has increased. And yeah, we are, like Stefan and I'm sure Sam, absolutely amazed and petrified in equal measure by the pace of technological change. So the next thing I'm going to do after I finish this call is read the excellent article from Saturday's FT about AI, and learning and doing, I think, is part of the answer to that. Thanks again for the question.
Well, thanks very much, and I'll hand back over to Sam. But Alex, it's been a pleasure discussing this with you today, and hopefully lots of food for thought for everyone here.
Absolutely. I think start off with a big thank you to both Alex and Stefan for joining us today. I think that's been a really interesting and informative conversation, and I hope everyone who's attended has taken a lot from this. Thanks to everyone for joining. Just a reminder, if you are a CIPR member, that you can log attendance at this session against your CPD. We'll be sure to circulate all the links to the documents we've discussed today, so the Resist to toolkit and everything else. So we'll send that around to everyone who's joined, along with the recording if you'd like to watch back. But yes, just a final thank you to everyone, especially to Alex and Stefan for joining today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and week.